Thanks for coming this evening. We have a pretty cool lineup tonight. So we're gonna talk about building, talk about business, talking about taxes. We also gonna be talking about insurance, pasture management, and then I'm gonna do a little talk about nutrient management as well. It's that time of the year, MDA is gonna be out asking me about nutrient management. So let's get it started, and we'll start with Amy O'Neill.
Hi there. It's good to see you. Amy O'Neill is my name, as I was introduced, and I'm a local gal, grew up in Hartford County and grew up on a farm and showed horses in 4-H, worked with the Hartford County Farm Fair, and have a local business where I provide tax accounting services to the community, which is actually a third generation business, and still maintain a small farm of my own with my husband. And so one of the focuses of my business practice is agriculture, taxes and business planning, and the specific character of agriculture in terms of the financial and business aspects of it. So when I was asked to come here today, the topic that I was asked to discuss is how to make a profitable business and what to do and what not to do if you are enterprise. And when it comes to agriculture profit, so one of the things that I prepared, I have a handout for you, and this handout is kind of difficult to get you with my phone number if you want to call me. But I want to just review some of the aspects of an agricultural tax return that make it different from general business tax return. And that's an important thing to know when you're going into business enterprise, because you have the aspect of setting up your business and operating your business, but you also have the tax accounting, the tax and the accounting side of that. And it's helpful to know that there are some different characteristics about agriculture that are in place in our laws with respect to taxation. And those are generally beneficial to the business owner, small business owner. And so I've highlighted some of these in this handout, and then we'll talk about how you can bring that into your business plan and also the application of your business. There are, and the fact of the matter is that agriculture has a very strong lobby in the federal and state. We're always complaining about, but farmers like to complain about how the government is doing up. But quite frankly, there are many aspects of the law that are beneficial to the agricultural business owner. We just have to fight to keep them. And that's why we continue to have our lobbyists. But there are some items, for example, farm vehicles. And I know that this evening is an equine evening, and that you all are probably all in some sort of equine related business activity. And I'm here to tell you that it's interesting to me that there are tax preparers and business planners who call horse boarding rental activity and not an agricultural activity. And they call training a business activity and not an agricultural activity. That is a very narrow definition. My definition, and it is substantiated within the code, is if you're working with livestock, it is agriculture. That's livestock is agriculture. So just because you're boarding or training horses, that doesn't make your business any different than if you are working with cattle or sheep or pigs or chickens or bees or any other type of livestock. It is an agricultural pursuit. Now, when it comes to accountants and accountancy, if you're in a room of, and I have been in a room of 300 some accountants taking a continuing education class, and you raise your hand, how many people actually do tax returns in the Baltimore metro area? There's my sister and me and maybe 3 other people who actually do farm returns and are coming to the continuing education program. So it is a very small minority, and there are, I have actually clients who have family members who are CPAs and seasoned tax professionals, but their family members don't want to touch an ag return because it's a whole different set of rules that are not employed in general business practices. So these are good things to know when you're in an agricultural pursuit, to know that there are some beneficial aspects to the agricultural tax preparation, and also some other activities such as the farm tag. There is confusion about farm tags. There are two different kinds of farm tags. There's a K tag that has a very, very small annual registration. It's like $5, maybe up to $10. This is a couple of years old. But the K tag, that not only has to be part of an ag operation, but it also has a very limited range of distance. So to have a K tag, you cannot be driving to Ocean City for a horse show. You are violating that K tag, and if you get pulled over, you are going to be penalized because you are violating those rules. And but on the other hand, you can have a farm vehicle registration, which still has a reduced fee for the annual tag. It doesn't have the same distance requirement or limitation, but you still have to prove that you have a farm schedule on your tax return. And if you have not yet produced a tax return, this farm schedule is a Schedule F for farming. And I have a copy of one in the handout so that you can see some of the classes of expenses. So you have to have a farm business that, and then you can get this farm vehicle registration. Also, as you know, or may know, or don't know, agricultural purchases are exempt from sales tax when they are specific agricultural purchases. So there's a whole class, a list in Maryland of what are deemed agricultural purchases and what are not deemed agricultural purchases. But to be able to purchase and be exempt from the payment of sales tax, you must again produce proof that you have established an agricultural business. And the way that you prove that is a Schedule F in your tax return, that you establish that you have an agricultural operation. Now, there are many products that you can no longer be exempt from the collection of sales or the payment of sales tax, even though you use them on the farm. Much to my husband's dismay, he gets ticked off all the time about the state of Maryland, because if you buy fence boards, you have to pay 10 sales tax. Doesn't happen to my family. So he goes to Pennsylvania because Pennsylvania doesn't collect sales tax on fence boards if you are a farmer, and you can fill out the farm exemption in Pennsylvania. Now, farm exemption. So to be a qualified farmer and complete the farm exemption certificate, you do need to produce proof that you are a qualified farmer. One way is to show your Schedule F. Another way is to obtain a federal identification number that lists the name of your farm. Federal identification number that lists the name of your farm, and that is obtained from the Internal Revenue Service. A federal identification number is an alternate identification number that replaces your Social Security number for purposes of business transactions. So if you have a bank account, you file that bank account under your Social Security number. If you have a business, if you set up a business, you can opt to register that business with the Internal Revenue Service and obtain a federal identification number. And if you register that federal identification number with the name of your farm in that federal identification number application, the IRS gives you a letter that says this is your new ID for your business activity. Now you don't have to use your Social Security number. We're going to track it under this identification number. And if you have that document, you then are typically accepted by the state, by different businesses within the state as being exempt from sales tax because you are a farmer. This man.
Does that doesn't include like grain stuff or wood, unless you sell them?
You don't have to collect sales tax in the sale.
No, I mean, like if I go to the feed store.
right.
And I buy feed, am I paying tax on it, if I'm feeding into horses that are in my business?
That's where you can apply to be recognized, the question of, do I have to pay sales tax on feed? If you're just got a couple of horses in the backyard that are your yard ornaments, and you claim you're not the farm. But if you have a business operation, then you can ask the vendor, the farm store, do you recognize a farm sales tax exemption, and will you recognize it for my purchases of feed and supplements and things like that? And if you complete the form and they accept it, then you can, that be exempt from collection of sales tax.
It's sort of the state, but your exemption form is with the Maryland state, and Maryland state has to bring you for being a producer, an added producer. I think that's the only way.
And Maryland has an exemption statement.
Yeah, but you have to apply to this, you have to apply to this.
Well, actually, you just have to use their, it all depends on the vendor. So Maryland actually does not have a,
Did you get a sales and use tax?
you actually don't have to get a sales and use tax exemption license from the state as an agricultural producer to be exempt from sales tax. The vendor will accept the exemption form, and you otherwise have the documentation to support that. Maryland doesn't issue that exemption form. You can go on the website and type, print it, and then fill in your information and give it to the vendor.
And the mill itself, it's not worth them.
I'm sorry?
The mill, they accept that.
Yeah, it's just, it's an exemption statement, and it's on the Maryland website, so, and it says retail, ag retail sales tax exemption. And you fill it out and you sign it. It's the act of signing as the
Yeah,
buyer.
for the one of the ag industries, you actually have to.
There are other, some vendors require something more.
They can go to the state.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you know, we have a sales and tax exemption certificate. And then just-
Right, see, there are, and then there's, it's also vendor specific, and there are vendors who become a lot more terrible about it.
Yeah,
And they will require you to,
yeah,
they're, you know, either just collect the sales tax and say you're on the road,
yeah,
or, require you to go through more extensive
yeah.
support, yes.
So you don't actually have to produce anything. If you have a boarding facility,
Correct,
you can still apply for
the agricultural sales
our
tax,
test.
yes.
I was thought,
Boarding
that's so I thought you had to produce something.
The boarding of horses is an agricultural activity, yeah, and it's as an equine activity.
But you have to show profit or loss.
So to be a business, if you show, to be recognized as a business, you need to actually complete a business return. And have it as part of your income tax return.
But that's not required in order to build
And yes, if you, to be recognized for the retail sales tax exemption, you have to be a business operator. You have to be a business operator. To be recognized.
I have the same question as this. Do you have to be a producer, or can you just be teaching writing lessons? Less than the state of that. All.
You have, if you also have horses that you are using.
Yeah,
that you have those, yes.
Yeah.
It's not just production of a crop or production of breeding facilities, for example. The definition of the agricultural facility does extend to different agricultural operations and equine operations that are farm based. So that is, so that's how you can apply that, but you do have to be actually operating a business that is a recognized business. And that's getting into, what is, which we'll talk about is, what is a profitable business? How do you recognize if you're a profitable business? What can you do to enhance your profits? And how long can you report a business that's showing a loss before the Internal Revenue Service says you're not a business. So we'll talk about that. Another thing I wanted to talk about is if you are an agricultural employer, you have, which includes, again, the businesses for according to training, if you're an agricultural employer, then you are exempt from paying into the unemployment system on your employees' wages. I do, however, recommend that if you are going to take that position as your agricultural employer, that you have your employees sign a statement that they recognize that you are not paying into the unemployment system on their benefit, on their pay, on their wages. Because if you don't pay into the unemployment system, then they don't have any unemployment account. Unless it's good, in which case everybody got unemployment, but I'm not, but that's not the norm. The other employment difference for an agricultural employer is that if you're an agricultural, if you are a standard employee and your employer provides you with housing or a vehicle or meals, all of that is added to your W-2 wages. You actually pay tax on those fringe benefits. Agricultural employers are able to provide those fringe benefits without having them to be W-2. So that can be advantageous to both your employee and to you as the employer, because they're not added to W-2 for purposes of Social Security taxation. And they're still at expense of the employer. So, but the employee does not have to show there. So that's why you can have a tenant, well, and a tenant employee on your property, a tenant dwelling on your property, your employee lives in that dwelling, you can pay all the costs of that dwelling on behalf of the employee, and it's not required to be added to their W-2. But if I, as Indian Hills County, wanted to give my staff a house as a fringe benefit, all of that cost would be added to that staff person's W-2 and be subject to their income tax. Not that it was an expense, but they still have an income tax. If you're an agricultural employer, there are a couple of other little minor things that we'll go into a whole lot, but if you're a regular, not employer, if you're an agricultural taxpayer, as you know, as a regular taxpayer, you have to pay money in through withholdings from your W-2 or estimated payments against income. If you're an agricultural taxpayer, you have the option of filing your tax return on or before March 1 of the year and paying all your tax at one time, and you're not required to make estimated payments. If you show a loss, there is a special income averaging that you can apply. If you're an ag business, there's a fuel tax credit for gasoline that's used on the farm. If you are a Maryland registered LLC or corporation, and you if you're a Maryland registered LLC or corporation, there's a $300 annual fee. If you are an agricultural operation and meet qualifications of a certified family farm, instead of paying $100 a year, you only pay $100 a year. Of course, it costs $100 to get that certification recognized, but once you do that, you save $200 a year using the focus. There also, if you're a regular business, you have to file something called a personal property return. You have to pay something called personal property tax. If you are an agricultural operation, you are exempt from the personal property tax. You are aware of that. Finally, if you own real estate and you have an agricultural operation on your property and you have more than 6 acres of your property dedicated to that agricultural operation, and you can show at least $2,500 annual gross income from that 6+ acres of land on your real property, you are eligible to receive a real estate tax benefit, which is a reduced assessment called an agricultural use assessment. So that's another benefit to agricultural operations, but you have to have at least 6 acres. You have of land that is in use, and you have to show at least $2,500 a year gross income from your agricultural production. Unless the 6 acre rule can be waived if you have some sort of niche agricultural operation, such as herbs that you're selling, or honey, or an aquatic operation. You could have an aquatic production operation on less than 6 acres. Certainly you can have beehives, you can have an herb business or produce business on less than 6 acres of land. And if you can show that you are actually producing that minimum amount of income on your less than 6 acres of land, then you would also have the opportunity to receive that agricultural use assessment. The assessment of lands is the number on which real estate taxes are based. So therefore, if you have an ag use assessment where it may be land is worth 8, 10, 15, 20,000 an acre, if it's ag use assessed, it's capped at 3,000 an acre in Maryland. So that can be a significant savings, the larger acreage that you have. And that's statewide. Then so those are some of the benefits that you can realize if you are an agricultural business. So let's talk about the topic that I was asked to discuss with you, which is, how do you know if your business is profitable and how do you set up a profitable business? One of the things in this schedule, if you have never looked at one, this gives you some of the classes of expense that the revenue service expects to see on an agricultural tax. So that's the function of this form. Just if you haven't, if you've struggled with, what are qualified expenses? What can I actually deduct? What makes sense in preparing my business return? This gives you an outline of what the Internal Revenue Service is looking at as a general rule. So you want to go to business, you think you have a service or a product or a property that can produce income, and you want to give it a shot. How do you do that? What is your business plan? Well, it's all, agriculture is no different from any other business you've learned. One of the first statements that you make. It's no different from any other business. You have to decide what you have to project. What is the income source? How much can I produce from this activity? And what are my expenses going to be to produce that income? And depending on the type of activity that you have, there are all sorts of determining factors with respect to potential of the income. And certainly the market is one of the bigger factors, especially if it's a service based. So if you want to board horses, or if you want to train horses, then it's very important to know your competition, because the market's going to set your price in many ways. You know your competition so that you know what your price is going to be. And from there, you also want to take a realistic look at the expenses. So when you look at your expenses in the production of your activity, then when I say realistic, don't ignore what those expenses should be or will be in terms of an income production, which includes the plant, the property on which the activity is going to be generated. So if it's on your farm, what does it cost every year for real estate taxes? What do you pay a mortgage? What does that mortgage mean? What are your utilities bills? How much does your phone cost? How much does your internet cost? Just basic expenses of getting up every day and living on that piece of property. If you're renting a piece of property, what is the rent going to be, and what are your other expenses for that rental? And by the way, how much does it cost to get there? If you're going to have your activity someplace off your residence, and that will give you an understanding of whether your business can be profitable based on the market conditions, what you can generate, and then what are your hard costs to get there. Many numbers are subject to your own control, such as how much will you spend on marketing? How much do you have to spend on marketing? How are you going to get your marketing out there? Can you create your own website, or will you rely exclusively on Facebook? Do you have time to monitor Facebook? How are you going to get the word out that you're out there producing whatever it is that you're producing? And how do you reach your market? So these are the questions you ask yourself. In the world of starting a small business, especially a business that you are. Said that one. So if you're going to go into business, you have to ask yourself, is this a side business or am I going full bore? Is this something that I'm gonna start on the side and let it grow and see how it goes and see if I like it? Or am I gonna go, this is gonna become my full-time activity? These are two very different models. They each require a records keeping system so that you can honestly analyze your business. And I say honestly analyze it because too often people, I think in small businesses, people don't candidly look at what that business is actually offering. And then you also ask yourself, is it worth it once you get to the end of the day? So on one hand, if you decide to start your business as a side business, that gives you a little, that can be less risky because your investment may be less, it will be less than if you were to go full bore. So let's just say you have, you've been boarding a horse somewhere, but you've been able to buy a piece of property, you have some extra stalls, you think, well, I'm going to board them and see how it goes and get a little bit of extra income and work it from there. Well, that's fine. That can work. And the key is to keep track of your income and your outgo. Create a system of keeping track of your income and your outgo so that you aren't scrambling at the end of the year, to get your taxes done, but even to know whether you've been charging enough for your services. Have you, are you actually making a profit? There's no magic. There's not no magic in this. It is a very essential method of organization of your numbers. And one of the very essential actions that you can take, and it really does make this whole process much easier, is to discipline yourself to open a separate bank account and then run your operation through that separate bank account. Now, people say, oh, well, the business account costs too much money, but I'm going to pay for it. Well, okay, then open another personal account, but just keep it separate from your household account. That in and of itself is going to give you a very good idea of what your business is actually generating. And then you discipline yourself to use that account only for business expenditures. And if you don't have enough money in that account, don't go to your personal account, buy something, put money in your business account so that you can purchase from the business account. Sounds real rudimentary when I say it, yet that's probably one of the least organic actions for people to take when they're starting a side business. If you're, oh, this is a side business, I'll figure it out later on. I'm just gonna, I'll take some money in, I'll pay for things and I'll just do it all through my house account because it's too much trouble to have two bank accounts. I don't want to deal with it. Well, you will not know how your business is operating if you do that. You just won't. But if you take that time and discipline yourself to open that separate bank account, use that for your operation, use that debit and credit card for your operations. And if you need extra money, take it from your personal account. So the Schedule F lets you know some of those primary basic farming expenses that the Internal Revenue Service expects to see on a farm return. But other foundational expenses that can become a little are less clear are what of my, in this circumstance where you are operating from your home farm, and what of my base operational expenses can I allocate to my business? Because you can allocate operating expenses of your property to your business activity. It is a matter of apportionment based on the actual circumstances. And so there are a variety of different ways to establish that apportionment. If you are looking at what is the relative cost of my home office, it's very easy. You look at the above grade square footage of your house, the square footage of your office space, do the math. That office space is X percentage of the house as a whole. If you have outbuildings, then you can either retain the services of an appraiser to give you relative value. You can look on your insurance bill for your property and find the breakdown of the values of the buildings, and then take a proportionate share of the value of the buildings relative to the value of your home. That becomes a proportionate share of your real estate taxes and your homeowner's insurance. You can, your farm insurance. If you pay a special insurance just for your business activity, that's 100% deductible. Mortgage interest can be allocated based on that factor. Land, underlying land, you also have to factor that. So you have, and that you have a value of the underlying home site, and then you have the value of the farmland, or the rest of your land, and they are different. I happen to be a multidisciplined professional, and I have licenses as a tax preparer and appraiser. I'm also an auctioneer and a real estate broker, but as a tax preparer and appraiser, I'm uniquely qualified because I can look at somebody's farm property or somebody's piece of real estate, and I can say, well, you have this barn, that barn, that barn, you have the garage, you have the house, you have the land. This is the value of the land under the house. This is the value of the surrounding farmland. This is the value of the apportioned value of the buildings, because I'm an appraiser, not because I'm an accountant. If you are not, if you're an accountant, then you need to look to other sources. Well, I'm saying you can use an insurance bill, you can use the assessment, or you can go to a real estate appraiser and ask for that apportionment, and that then becomes your distribution of your foundational operating expenses. Also, your electric expense, you have to really look at that, because that may not be the same proportionate amount as your home office and barns percentage on real estate taxes, insurance, mortgage interest. Because if you've got water heaters out in the barn, if you have refrigerators out in the barn, if you have, another set of washing machine and dryer in the barn, you have hot water and you're washing horses, you've got a lot of utilities out there. You may find that the bulk of your electric bill may be your ag operation. You have to be able to substantiate. One way of doing it is you can get statistics from the utility company. If I have a 2,000 square foot house for standard, set of 4 people living in a house, well, statistically, if that's a general energy efficient house, what's the electric use? If you have no historical basis, such as that you didn't have pre-horse operation history, then you can use statistics to determine what that percentage is. But your business operation can pay for these percentage of use. When it comes to cell phones, if you have more than one phone in a family unit living on the property, then one of those phones can be 100% deductible for your business use. If you only have one phone, then get a Google number and call that your home phone so that you can take 100% of your cell phone for your business use. The IRS no longer requires any apportionment on cell phone service. Same with the internet. Because so much commerce is internet based, the Internal Revenue Service no longer requires an apportionment of the internet service. However, be careful to keep if you have television service in a bundle, you need to break up your bundled service. So if you have TV, now if you're streaming, then they can't really complain about that, except you can't really off your Netflix subscription. But if your internet service, is also your streaming service for entertainment, that's fine, but you don't want to write off those other sites.
For my horses.
So if your horses have a specific show that got on its own, so needed, and then you need to, write on Paramount Plus, I mean, I'll let you shake that to the audience. Right? It's all about, because it's all about defending what you're doing. If the Internal Revenue asks, is it defensible? Does it make sense for your specific situation? And I have been on several audits, memorable audits, because I was retained by people who had their tax returns done by somebody else. But when the IRS asked about it, that other else person wasn't prepared to talk to the IRS. And then I was referred, the people referred to me, because at least I could talk about animals and I could talk about farming. And I know the difference between a heifer and steer, and I know the difference between a hay and straw, and I can look at an operation and know something about a variety of ag operations. And this particular audit, the one that was most memorable, was a dressage person, woman who had a dressage, and she was raising up her dressage, and she was training her animal, and she eventually sold her horse for something like $100,000. And the IRS wanted to disallow all of her losses in the prior years. And so when I sat with the IRS agent and explained that the only way you can raise up an animal to be worth $100,000 is to train them for 3, 5, 7 years at shows where you don't get any money. That's your investment. That was in fact an operation or loss that was legitimate and qualified, and the IRS agent's eyes rolled back in his head anyway. He had no clue what I was talking about anyway, but also couldn't deny it.
Back up. The IRS knew because she reported the gain in selling the animal in the first place. Is that-
Yes.
Okay, that's right.
Yes, yeah, so she had this big gain.
So,
So then they were looking at these losses that led up to the game in the years before, because they
and
audited.
they didn't want to.
They didn't want to, and they wanted to deny those losses. They said, oh, that's fine, you paid all this tax, but what about what's going on before? And that's not a comment, it's somebody else who's account was audited because they showed a big profit.
She sold $100,000, but she says that she only gained 20,000 and tries to write everything else off.
Well, actually, she showed the gain because she had been taking losses in the prior years. And their problem was they wanted to disallow those losses. Period. They weren't even want to, they were going to let her bring them forward and use them against the gain. And even if they had, she would have had to pay back taxes on all those prior tax returns where their losses were shown. And setting, and bringing this animal to, and then she happened to have one animal, but it is a legitimate business practice. It is developing, and agriculture is one form of business that's recognized as having periods of years to develop your product. So if you go back to this, is it 5 years? No, actually, it's whatever it takes to develop your product. So
It's not.
in the standard world, you're supposed to show 2 years of profit out of every 7. But, and the other piece of that is you are setting up a business. You're not supposed to show any losses until you start generating income. So in a standard business or standard rental activity, until you start collecting rents or collecting money for your activity, you are not supposed to report that activity. Those are setup expenses that you then can bring into the business when you start generating income. Agriculture is not held to that same limitation. So if you're starting, I have a client who's selling blueberries. She's going into the blue world. She's going into blueberries. And that's what she's going to sell, blueberries and raspberries. Well, you don't get blueberries the first year you plant them. But agriculture tax reporting allows you to report that activity and the expenses of that activity in the years until you start producing the berries. Now, if you go into that and you never sell any berries, now you're at risk of an audit that's not going to be successful. You're not going to like the outcome because you were just playing around. But if you're serious about it, you're moving into so you have to make sure you start showing some sales. It's not profit, though. It doesn't have to be profitable. It just has to show production. That you're moving forward. The rule is the activity being conducted in a manner that intends to generate a profit? In a manner that is an intentional business-like manner. Now, then the question is my business profitable? That's where it's important to know all those foundational expenses that you can use to offset income as you generate it. But B, if you're operating in the hole, year over year over year over year, you have to ask yourself, how much am I really trying to make a profit? If you're operating a boarding operation, let's say something, especially service-based, if you're operating a boarding operation, if you're operating a training, giving lessons and training, that's a service-based ag operation. And yes, there are lots of foundational expenses that you have to pay anyway because you have the farm. But if you're still showing tens of thousands of dollars of loss, you have to look, is there a cash loss in here? Is there a cash loss? Am I buying all these things just so I can play around and pretend to be, a trainer, or just so I can have extra horses to keep my horses company? And is that really a smart move on my part? I have a couple of dairy operators who are their legacy dairy operators. They have the one stand like 25, 30 head. And we've been tracking how much extra money they've been putting into it. And it's the only reason they're still dairying is because the wife has another farm. So you have to take I know it's time to stop and talk to them. You have to take a candid look at your expenses. And those expenses include your foundational expenses of having a property. One of the benefits of working off your own property is that you can let your business help pay for what you have to spend anyway. But that's not always the best reason to run a business. So, thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. And you have her contact info. She's a wealth of knowledge, so feel free.
And I am the most contact repair, so this evening, I'm not going to take advantage of the rest of the info.
Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah, thank you for coming out this busy season.
Yeah, thanks for asking me. I'm always happy.
Yeah. Thank you.
You ever work on taxes for businesses that do a side nonprofit?
Yes.
Tied into.
Yes.
This, and then they're doing an offset to their expenses?
Yeah, well, the nonprofit piece, that's a very complicated, and you have to be careful about that. But I am knowledgeable about nonprofits. If you want to call me, you're welcome to do that. Thank you. You're welcome. All right. Enjoy.
Thank you. All right, next we have Sable from Garrity, right? Garrity Insurance. So she's gonna talk to you about different policies, what you guys should be thinking about. So I did not realize that most of this should be covered. Well, in your little handout, I print out some flyers and stuff with like main questions that I get all the time, simple stuff. But so my background, I've been in horses my whole life. I've moved always been strong, born and raised Carroll County, have a little boarding farm out in Harper County. So a lot of this stuff pertains to me too. So, commercial account manager at Garrity Insurance. I have done insurance for the past 12 years. Farms, horses, all that fun stuff is my niche. Hello, I can talk to you all day about this, but like I said, I'm keeping it short. Insurance, very boring. So, just as an idea, who in here is just boarding? You run a boarding business? So a lot of people that I come across, they think like you run the boarding business off of your actual like home where you live. They think their homeowner's insurance covers that. No, as soon as you bring an animal on that property that is not yours, that they're giving you income, if there was some sort of claim, they're gonna deny anything. So that's where you come into your farm owners. So farm owners pretty much is like your homeowner's policy, but has all the extra goodies, bells and whistles to cover your operation. So, you know, you should be looking at $1 million in your liability to cover that. And then also now you can add in your barn, your home, which is what your typical homeowners covers. But then also you're gonna add in your care, custody, control, and your boarding coverages. So care, custody, control pretty much covers you for, you have those horses in your care, custody, control. You are in charge of taking care of them, feeding them, all the day-to-day stuff. So if something were to happen, this is the coverage that takes care of you. A lot of people think, oh, I just have a great, you know, contract or something. That's not gonna help you. Like, the insurance is gonna help you cover all your lawyer fees, and everyone is so happy nowadays. I see it every single day. Stupid claims, dumb, stupid. Also, with people keeping horses on your property, they should have what is called a private horse, like horse owner's policy. So pretty much that will cover them if their horse is stupid and does something to break your property. So for instance, I have a Florida, I love her horse gets my nerves, but he broke out one day and just went galloping off through my property at 4 o'clock in the morning, ran through my goat field, destroyed everything. And what he did, you would have thought he got hurt. No, he was fine. However, my fencing was broken, the goat field was broken. I think my goats are still traumatized. If I were to ask her to, you know, she could actually, she has a private horse owner's policy. She could actually use that to pay me for the damages her horse caused. But I'm not like that. They're horses. So, along with your general liability, if you have any trainers coming in, or if you're running a lesson policy, you should also have coverage for your trainers. So if you have a trainer coming onto your property to teach, they should have their own liability policy and make you the additional shirt on that. So what that means is if they do something to cause bodily injury or something, or property damage, it covers you from having to be exposed to that loss. So you won't have anything to do with that. It'll be their policy that responds.
So if their horse gets loose from your property and runs out to a road and causes a car accident, is it your policy that's covering it?
My policy will cover that because I am covered for that. Yes. However, if you have a little homeowner's policy and you have your pets there, pet horses that they're just that you're retired old horses that aren't going anywhere, your homeowners will cover you for that if they were to get out and hurt someone. But as soon as they go to trip, like go to shows or whatnot, that's when you should also have your private horse owner's policy. It is cheap. I think I wrote one not that long ago. It was like 5 horses included. It was like $300 for the year. It's very cheap. It gives you $1 million of coverage, which is really good. Also on top of your farm owners, you can pretty much add an umbrella onto it, which gives you an extra layer of liability on top of everything. Another thing that I come across with a lot, actually has happened to me, is your horse trailer coverage. A lot of people think that as soon as you hook that horse trailer up to your truck, that common collision on your truck extends to your horse trailer. That is not the case. Does not happen. So any horse trailer you have, if like for my instance, I hit a tree. And it did just a fistful size damage to the corner of my trailer. And it was be $12,000 to fix it. Stupid. Just hit it perfectly. If I didn't have comprehensive coverage on my trailer, I would have been completely screwed. Insurance company totaled my trailer, and what I got from my trailer was like new. But if I didn't have any of that coverage, I would have paid $12,000 to get my trailer fixed, or just go buy a new one. So that's one thing I see a lot, where as soon as you hook up the truck, your common collision automatically extends. The liability will extend from your truck to your trailer, but your full coverage will not. So that's a big thing that a lot of people ask me about. And then another coverage I see a lot of good questions on is like the equine mortality and major medical. So pretty much insuring your horse, like you do mortality, if something happens and your horse has to be put down or whatnot, you will get the value of your horse for what pretty much what you paid for. Depending on the carrier, once you hit that 15-year mark, the rate goes up because they're getting older and insurance, it's a lot of large numbers, and as horses get older, we've done that more things happen. So some carriers will stop at 15, some go to 18, I think some go to like 22, and there's some like tweaks and stuff you can't insure for major medical and stuff like that. It's just like basic mortality. And major medical will cover you, depending on what policy you have, it will cover you for surgeries. I know kissing spine surgery is a big thing around here. It covers for that, radiographs, all kinds of different things, new Bolton, stuff like that. Versus an equine mortality which covers you for value, of course, it has to get put down, so.
And those are reassessed yearly, so
Yes.
its value is just the value.
Yep, so if say you show on a circuit somewhere, if you want to increase your horse value, pretty much the underwriter just asks for like the show records. You know, or if you end up buying a horse for $50,000, you can insure it for $50,000. But then trading, it can just go up with having the show proof. So. But yeah, that's pretty much.
My question, if you are going to get, if your horse is already had like some difficult, surgery, and now you decide to hurt, you still hurt.
Yes. Depending on the carrier, they're gonna wanna see documentation stuff, for pre-existing condition, but yes. More than likely, they will, they will probably give you, there'll probably be some tweaks and stuff in that, like I said, every carrier is different from Markel to Positive, everything's different, how they insure stuff, but yeah. 9 out of 10 times, you also can.
So they won't exclude based on pre-existing.
No. Not the ones that I've come across.
I was pretty sure my policy.
Like I said, it all depends, like I used to have my horses insured through the Hartford, and theirs was like, so, like. There was not a whole lot there for stuff like that versus you go to Broadway, who is a huge equine carrier. It all depends, you have to read the policy and ask the underwriter, each carrier is different. But mostly, from what I think I've seen that I've written, they do. What are you doing for you guys? Sure, it's fun. I go on and on and on all day about it so much.
Is, oh, I said, oh, if you have like a just private place, with like one horse, whatever, your person horse. But then like someone else keeps their horse there, but they don't pay you, like you just let other people. I would like to have like some sort of special insurance.
I would, sometimes you might be able to get away with it a little bit with your homeowner's policy, but. Just from what I've seen, I would still have something, because it could be your best friend and. That you never know, and. Yeah. Something happens. Some carriers will allow it, I know most like that Erie is a big homeowner area, and I know for a fact, as soon as you bring on another animal, and you're talking about business, they were like done.
Yeah.
I can say that exactly, so.
How value.
Sorry?
It's a good value, how do we?
Yeah, I just went up like,
Yeah, I mean, the fact was nice for her. They, like, but they have some that does. Yeah, like, how do they value the horse? Like, how they old horse?
an older horse, it'd be off with that report, like they'll actually have forms for you to sign out, like fill out, and your vet will evaluate it and everything. I do know if you adopt, obviously you're not gonna try to buy her, I think the base price starts at 3,000 for mortality. So, but it would be, they give you some papers to fill out with your vet, and that's how it would determine that. Yeah. Yeah, and as the horse gets older, you know, if the coverages kind of get a little more limited. It's probably doing a whole lot, but something that's definitely good to have.
I mean, I think we're solid on the mortality.
Yeah. You never get stand, right, you know, and it's. And yeah, if it's like free or anything like that, or adoption, I'm pretty, the base price is about 3,000, so I mean, even though it's free, you know. Yeah, so don't want anything to happen, but if something happens,
Yeah, no, sometimes I.
yeah. We got salted for it, paid. Based on the rate, I mean, if you have a, like, I just shared one, like, it was 30,000, they added in, I think, 15,000 major medical, it was 1,100 for the year. So, it can get up there, I mean, you know, it's also based on showing, that was based on showing. I mean, your trail riding is like, the rate's gonna be a lot less, but you're not out doing the work. Don't tell them to jump. Yeah.
Probably, I'd say in my policy, you know, really don't disclose what's covering it. An additional for major medical. I have no idea that happens I was paying was covered, so I wasn't implying it.
Yeah, I always have it too, but like, and then
Don't
don't use, cause then like every year it gets reassessed, you're like, oh, you're right.
And then the following
Don't
year,
like
it's,
stuff.
They're just never stand.
well, they basically want fund policy, which I never. You know,
As we did, they probably gonna go have it later on this like.
I never promised my guidance to you. So she said for that. Because why, just not do the job. So that's how it's.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you very have like different one of these was pushed out. I worked my sugar. Oh, you don't give the surgery. I'm like, it's really cute. So the next year, it's super, because. The equine insurance is a little bit different, like commercial policies, I can negotiate pricing with my underwriters. For all commercial policies, even farm policies, I can negotiate that pricing, but when it comes to equine. It's really one, I have no say.
Any other questions?
Alright. Actually take all the goodies.
One more question. Yeah. Then one thing is about sure.
Oh, for boarding.
Yeah.
So there are different lines, so the families cover, so. Yeah, if you have borders, not even just people for farmers, like, if you don't have a farmer, people come bring their stuff there, and if there is a event or whatever. it can be covered. But you add that families coverage onto your policy for farmers, so that gives you a little extra coverage for like all your clients. Stuff. Y'all know how much stuff. Thanks, Sable. I don't.
So if you, this is just somebody who has one
Finances, I just started my date modified usually, and that's the one. I need to click on my stuff. Click date, oh yeah. There you go.
And then when I decided, I forced myself to because if I thought, so my policy.
You're just running a Zoom meeting with yourself.
I am.
Well, click it on this one, and see if
It's looking right on the screen.
oh, I wonder. No, there we go, this. Yes. Sometimes like, maybe it's this one, yes, you know,
Click out of that one, maybe that's what it's, oh, there
There
you
we
go. Okay, so it's
but it still
showing-
looks okay on that one,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, good,
Okay.
and I think this should work. Good. Yeah,
Oh, it even buzzes. when you
yeah,
click
it's
forward.
fancy. Okay, so our next speaker is Dr. Amanda Grev. She works with University of Maryland Extension. She's our horse specialist, and she's based out at our research center in Washington County. So she can talk to you about managing your pastures.
So I don't know anything about insurance, and I don't know anything about taxes, other than maybe how to do the most basic tax form of file. But we're gonna switch it up a little bit, and there is another way to think about money, and that is feed expenses, right? So we know that feed expenses is one of the biggest expenses for our horses. So we're gonna talk about feed, and because pasture makes up the bulk of that for a lot of horses. We'll focus a little bit on that today. Can't talk about any of you have questions. I didn't include it, but.
Oh, gosh. Okay.
There we
There you
go. Perfect. So we all know that horses have a forage requirement, right? So they need to eat a certain amount of forages in their diet. Every day, and the way their GI tract is set up is to consume those small, frequent forage-based meals, kind of browsing throughout the day. So naturally, naturally they'll spend a lot of hours of their day consuming forages. And at a minimum, the diet should contain about 50% forages. For most horses, this is probably more like 90%, right, of their diet or even higher. So it makes up a huge portion of the diet. So Like I said, we're gonna focus more on the pasture side of things today. It's spring, we're kind of coming into the summer season, but there's some things we can think about for hay as well. So on one hand, hay production or hay feeding relies more on space for storage, right? We need that space to store that hay. We're gonna have to use that to feed our horses. On the pasture side, we need land and space, and we'll talk about some really rough rules of thumb for kind of how much land or how much space we can assume, like per horse, depending on different turnout times or different turnout schedules. With the hay, one thing that we don't often think about in terms of time and labor and as a cost is it is a cost to remove that manure from stalls, from dry lots, from wherever that hay is being fed, right? We have to pay someone to do that, or we have to take our own time to do it ourselves. And we have to have a place to store that hay or that manure. We have to then, dispose of it or spread it in a field or, get rid of it in some way. So one advantage of pasture is that the nutrients from the horse are recycled right back onto the field, right? So that's kind of a monetary advantage. Really the big one with pasture though is if you actually sit down and crunch the numbers for feeding hay versus feeding pasture for the same horse, kind of similar situation, generally speaking, the pasture will come out to be about a third of the cost of the hay. So usually it is considered a more affordable source of forage for our horses, assuming we have well managed kind of productive pasture, and we'll talk about some strategies for achieving that. And then the other thing with hay, a little more labor intensive, like I said, not only with kind of cleaning up, but also, stacking that hay and purchasing that hay and finding hay and all those things that go along with hay. Pasture does take some work, especially if we want to maintain a good pasture. But I think hopefully my goal is to convince you that once you get going and once you get started with it, it's not as much work, once we get started. All right, so here's the consideration. So I always get asked, how many acres of pasture do I need for my horse to provide all of its kind of forage requirements? Again, this is during the growing season. Obviously, it won't come to the winter months in this. But to have enough pasture to maintain a good vegetative cover, so a good stand of pasture, and meet the entire forage requirements for one horse. And I broke this up into different lengths of turnout because I know some people turn out only in the morning, or some people turn out during the day only. Some people have 24/7. So I kind of broke it up that way. So one horse can be maintained on. Sorry, hold on. Here we go. You got a little pop up. I just closed it. Oh, okay. One horse can be maintained on a half acre of pasture if their turnout time is only a few hours a day, right? So if they're only out for an hour or a couple hours a day, they require a lot less pasture to meet that forage intake. If they're going to be out for, say, half a day to maybe kind of a full working day, then we are looking at maybe 1 acre of pasture per horse. If we're doing kind of that 8 to 12 hour window, or kind of like a long day, a full day of turnout, then we're looking at more like 1.5 acres of pasture. And if we want basically, 24/7 turnout, or, majority of the time spent outside, then we're kind of looking at that 2 acres ish per horse to kind of meet that forage requirement. So that's where we kind of get, oftentimes that rule of thumb of about 2 acres per horse gets thrown around. That's kind of, breaking that down a little bit further. So that's what we're going to assume for pasture for kind of. So knowing that, I always run into we like to have, more horses than maybe space we have, right? We're all guilty of that, whether we're boarding or whether it's our own personal horses. So if we are getting above these numbers, then we have to consider either 1, the pasture is going to suffer, 2, we need another place to put those horses, or 3, reducing turnout time to kind of, fit better into this structure. Does that make sense? Kind of, you can play with the math a little bit there. All right, and then of course, these are all assuming that the pasture is well managed to start with. All right, so importance of pasture management. So oftentimes, if we see a pasture that looks like this, we might think, oh, it's not too bad, right? There's, green grass over the whole field. I don't really see any bare spots. But I would argue that it's really, really easy to go from this to something like this, right? It happens quicker than you would like. And my point here is that there's not gonna be a single forage species that's gonna persist if we're overgrazing or continuously grazing a pasture, right? I wish there was, I would just tell you all to plant that and we could all go home. But there isn't, unfortunately, so we do need some management. And seed costs money, right? So we can have, you know, oops, oh wow. We can, I'm sorry. It's different point. We can have a pasture like this. And, you know, understand that it might look like this periodically, and we can just, you know, reseed it occasionally, and just that can be a strategy for managing pasture. But I would argue that that is a much more expensive strategy, probably in the long run, because seed costs right now they're, you know, high, but they're never cheap, right? Especially kind of good, you know, certified seeds. So keep that in mind as we go through. There's several places where I put, you know, this costs money. So we'll keep that in mind as we go through. So if we want a good, you know, a well-managed, nice productive pasture, we can use our management and we can have a lot of benefits, right? Maintaining the integrity of that pasture, improving the longevity, reducing soil erosion, increasing productivity, increasing forage quality. But the key here is that a good pasture requires good management. And since we're talking about profit or, you know, profit and economics today, we'll focus a little bit on increasing productivity, right? Because a more productive pasture means we have less hay to feed, and also improving the longevity of that pasture stand. And that again, all kind of ties back to our management. So the way I set this up is there's kind of 6 key components that I consider to be kind of essential for having a well-managed pasture. So we're going to kind of, you'll see there's some overlap on different ones, but we're going to kind of go through each of these. And we're going to start with the soil. So we like to go out to our fields and look at our horses, right? They're very pretty, they're very cute. You know, we always want to like look at them. We're all guilty of it, but we always look at our livestock first. Well, we soon realized that what those livestock are eating is contributing to their overall health, their overall well-being, etc. So we started saying, okay, let's look at the grasses, right? Let's look at what they're eating. Let's look at what's in the pasture. Let's start, you know, doing some assessment on that. Well, we do need to actually take this one step further, because to have good productive grasses, which make good productive horses, we need a healthy kind of base, a healthy soil system to work from. So I know there's a lot of numbers on here. I just wanted to point out a couple of things. So there's been some researchers who have kind of compiled or done some calculations on basically totaling up the biomass. So everything that exists either above ground or below ground. So you can kind of compare the two. And if you total up, so this example is beef cattle, I apologize, but the same thing could apply to horse pasture. So the above ground is up here. These top 2 lines, there's the cow and the pasture basically that are above the ground. So those 2 numbers are here, and then everything else you see in this chart is all of the below ground material. So roots, bacteria, fungi, nematodes, earthworms, all those things below the soil surface. And we're learning more and more, you know, with each passing year, the importance of that soil biological life on the production of a pasture system. So if we total these all up, above ground is around 3,000-ish pounds per acre. Below ground is 14,000 pounds per acre. So there's a lot happening below that soil surface. So just something to consider and to remember as we're thinking about our pasture productivity. So we need to look at the soil, and making sure we're having adequate soil fertility can help with all of these things. You know, establishment, root growth, uptake of nutrients, yield, weed pressure, stand vigor, resistance to drought, all of which make for a productive pasture, right? So what should we look at? We're not really going to go through kind of all the different nutrients today, but I did just want to touch on a couple things. When it comes to soil, the first is pH. Who has taken a soil sample and maybe knows the pH of their soil? Anyone of their pastures? Okay, so this is your take home. Everyone's going to do a soil sample, right? You can call Erica. She can come out and help you. There you go. Perfect. So soil pH is really the first thing we want to look at, because it's not as expensive as a lot of the other nutrients, especially right now. And B, it affects all of the other nutrients. So right here, we can see a range of acidity or range of pH from a more acidic one over here over to a more alkaline one over here. And these are all the different nutrients, and each of these black bars, basically, however thick that bar is, represents availability of that nutrient at a given pH. So the thicker the bar is, the more available that nutrient is at that pH. So you can see that as we get more acidic, as we move further to the left, some of our nutrients become less available. Things like phosphorus, calcium, magnesium that plants need, just like our horses need, become less available as our soil gets more acidic. At the same time, nutrients that we might not want to be more available because there's potential for toxicity sometimes can become more available. So like iron is an example, copper, aluminum, those all can eventually at certain levels lead to toxicity issues either for the plant or for the animal. And so those tend to become more available as our soil gets more acidic. So the goal is to maintain that pH in kind of that 6 to 7 range. This is what we consider ideal for most of our forages. You can see at this range, which is between the two yellow lines, most of our major nutrients are kind of at their most available. So those will help that plant be able to uptake those nutrients. The pH, in addition to nutrient availability, also affects root growth. So if you look at this image over here on the right, you'll see that at this pH of 6.5, we have much longer, much healthier looking roots compared to these two soils over here, which are the more acidic soil. So we had much more kind of scraggly, stunted roots, right? And so which of those is going to be more productive over time? Obviously, a plant with bigger, longer, healthier roots is going to be able to take up more nutrients, going to be able to take up more water from the soil, all of those things. So that's going to be a healthier plant over time. So check your pH, always one of the first things to look at on a soil analysis. You know, when you get your soil sample results back from the lab. This is just a list of other essential nutrients for plants. So you'll see a lot of them are very similar to kind of what our livestock require. There's macronutrients and micronutrients. A standard soil test will have the first three, or the first, not always nitrogen, but well, they'll have the first three, N, P, and K, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, because those are the ones needed in the biggest quantity. And then depending on the lab and which type of analysis you pick, you can look at some of the micronutrients as well. But my point is, we need to know what's in our soil because it's feeding our plants, which is feeding our horses. So they always say, you know, without a test, it's just a guess. Very true. We want to kind of know what we have in terms of nutrients. The other thing to think about in terms of soil and soil health is I like to think of it like a cycle. It's not just, okay, let's test these nutrients because they're always changing, right? So they're always kind of fluctuating to some extent. And there are things that are adding nutrients into a pasture system. And there are also things that are taking nutrients away from a pasture system, right? So what do I mean by that? Well, inputs are, so there's a natural mineralization in the soil that happens. So there's, you know, all those microbes and the biology that's in the soil is making more nutrients potentially available or unavailable over time. Fertilizer that we may be applying is adding nutrients. Manure is a big one that adds nutrients. I'll show you in a little bit, but adding feed, hay, minerals, feeding all those things on a pasture actually adds nutrients into a system, and it can make a really big difference actually on the soil fertility. And then lightnings, of course, with their ability to fix nitrogen can add nutrients. On the output side, if we're harvesting forage, if we're removing that, especially like a hay production system, if we take a hay cutting off of a field ever, that's removing a lot of nutrients. And the livestock themselves are removing nutrients, you know, obviously as they're consuming that forage. And then there's a little bit of lost pathways that can do it too. So what we want is for that cycle to be in balance, right? And when it gets out of balance, our outputs start really being heavier than our inputs. And basically what that means is we're kind of mining that soil for nutrients, right? So it may not be immediate, it may take a while for, you know, you start to see the effect of that. But over time, we will kind of start to see that production decline. So harvesting and grazing reduce nutrients. Grazing, though, does have a really big advantage compared to hay production, because like we said in the beginning, a lot of those nutrients are going through the horse and coming back out the other end, right? So I just wanted to, this is another example, just throw some calculations out there just to kind of illustrate that. So in production, like I said, we're removing a huge percentage of nutrients in a plant, and normally when we take a hay crop off, we're not feeding that hay back in the same field, right? We're feeding it elsewhere. So actually, for those of you who are purchasing hay, you're actually purchasing nutrients along with your hay that you're feeding your horses. Grazing, of course, we have that nutrient cycling, and actually it's a very, very high percentage of what goes into that animal that comes out the other end as well. So again, this is an example that was conducted with beef cattle, but again, the same kind of concept could easily be applied to horses. So these two situations are going to show nutrient removal, so how many nutrients are removed from an equal area basis, so 1 acre. So on this acre, if we took off 3 tons of hay, we'd be removing 150 pounds of N, 22 pounds of P, and 155 pounds of K. Kind of a lot, right? If you look at the grazing side and we look at the beef, or it would probably be somewhat similar numbers, I would guess, for the horses. We'd be removing 16 tons of N, 5 tons of P, and 1 ton of K. So you see that kind of cycle happening. We're removing a lot less of those nutrients. And then here's where that kind of ties back into our management strategies, right? So we've taken our soil test. We know what nutrients might be limiting. We know if our pH is limiting or not. But we also have to think about our nutrient distribution. So yes, we know that in a grazing system, our manure is depositing nutrients back on the field, but are we depositing it very evenly across the field? I would argue that most of the time we're probably not, right? So anyone ever seen a pasture with those big clumps, big tufts, right? So that may be an indication that there's some nutrient deficiency going on, because anywhere there's been a pile of manure or urine or whatever, there's been an extra shot of nutrients there, and you can see the difference in the production of the grasses from that extra shot of nutrients. And our livestock like to congregate. They like to go to similar areas of the pasture, right? They have probably their favorite spot where they always go, or it might be near the water or the gate, where they come in for the barn, etc. So essentially what they're doing is taking nutrients from the further out areas of the pasture and then redepositing them back to wherever their favorite place is. So we get this really uneven distribution. So they did this really cool study in Missouri, where they said, we're going to look at some different grazing management systems. So a continuous system, so no rotation, the animals just have access to the entire field, or some different, or subdividing that further into kind of tighter, smaller rotations. And they looked at how many years it took to get 1 manure pile per square yard. Anyone want to guess, for a continuous system, how many years it took? Years, not months. Any guesses?
50 years.
50? Any other guesses?
Well, doesn't it depend on the area and the amount of animals you have in there?
Yeah, you're right, yes, but
The more animals you have, the less time.
that's so each of these were the same area, continuous 14 days, 1 day, 1 day, it was the same total area. It was just they had access to the whole thing, or they had access to smaller sections and they were moved. It took 27 years to get 1 manure pile per square yard for a continuous grazing system. And that's because of that preference, right? Those animals are always going to the same spots. And so you can see how it would kind of shift the distribution of those nutrients. And by tightening those animals up into smaller paddocks and rotating them around that field, we were able to reduce that. So 7 to 8 years for a 2-week rotation, 4 to 5 years for a 4-day rotation, and then only a year or 2 for a 1-day rotation. I'm not saying
the entirety, if you were to.
yes. Yeah, so this is all the same area, so same size paddock. They just, instead of having access to the whole thing, they had access to this section, this section, this section.
So take out all of your centralized fence, take out all your fencing and give them up.
The thing around and then slide it all around.
Yeah, yeah, but yeah, so, and I'm not saying that we all should be subdividing our horses into small enough areas where they're only gonna be, a small amount at a time, so they move them every day. Like for most of horse people, that's not practical. For other livestock, species, that might be practical, especially if they're like trying to put weight on, grass finished, beef cattle or growing lambs, etc. So, we may not be down all the way to the 1 day rotation. But just, remember that the more we're kind of subdividing and rotating, the more we're kind of evenly distributing nutrients across a field.
Feel like in Yellowstone.
Yeah, I haven't watched Yellowstone, but yeah, potentially. I know. I would agree about that. And then we can think about the same thing for feeding hay, right? So remember I said if you're purchasing hay, you're purchasing a lot of nutrients along with that hay. And also you could ask the same question, how uniformly are those nutrients being distributed across the field? So this is at a research center down in North Carolina. It was a pasture that had beef cattle in it. And they took soil samples, grid samples, which means that they took a sample in all these different spots throughout the field at evenly spaced distances. So all these little orange circles you see is where we took a soil sample at all those different spots. And anywhere the orange circle is bigger is where there was a much higher concentration of phosphorus. So phosphorus is one of the nutrients that's a lot present in manure, right? So where do you think they were feeding hay on this field? Right here, right? Which makes sense. The barn is right here, right? And so this is like probably there's gates along this fence line. And so it's easy access. And you can see that phosphorus is actually really limiting when you get way out here. We have hardly any phosphorus. And here we have huge amounts of phosphorus. Here it's probably, excessive amounts of phosphorus. So feeding hay, if we have our soil samples and we know we have a certain pasture or field that's lower in nutrients, feeding hay on that field, if that's possible, can be a way to add nutrients, in a cheaper way. Or moving feeding spots around a little bit, even if they just shifted from, here to down here in this corner. They'd be shifting the placement of those. So using manure and using hay as fertilizer sources can be a really good way to not have to put fertilizer on our pasture, but to be able to add nutrients. Yeah.
One of the issues with moving the hay source around is that they create mud. And
Yes,
destroy the
that
ground.
is a complication.
So I kind of have to keep it in one area.
You're right. Yep. And so there's a couple of different strategies and that you have to kind of figure out what works for you. So some people, if they have a heavier sod and they don't have, and they have like, well-drained areas, they might not have as many issues with mud and they can, move their hay around a little more. Some people don't have that advantage. And if you're running into a lot of mud, then yeah, you don't want to be tearing up the field. So that's another consideration, but just something to keep in your mind. But yes, very good point. If they're really damaging it, then we probably want to limit it to one area. All right, so then this is the last thing on soil fertility before we get into the rest of it, but this is just showing two pictures from the same field. So this picture that's over here on the right is actually taken over here. You can see it kind of in the back of this picture. So side by side in the same field, and what this was a reestablishment or a replanting of some forage crops into a field down in North Carolina. And the only difference between these two photos is one side they added fertilizer based on what the soil test said, and on the other side they did not. And you can see- what was that?
Over how much of time? What's
I don't know when they added the fertilizer compared to when they seeded, but probably, or I would guess earlier that year, or a couple months before or something. And so you can see how well the forage is established. Over here, you see all of the nice grass kind of filling in, and it's a lot thicker. And over here, like it's struggling, right? It's barely coming up at all. So if we're looking to reseed and we're going to put the money into seed, we need to be setting ourselves up for success and making sure our soil nutrients are adequate before we do so. So just like I should have switched this from gains or milk production to performance. Suboptimal nutrients affects performance, right, of horses. Suboptimal nutrients in the soil you can think of as limiting your forage production. So that's what we start with. We always start with the soil. What about the plants, the grazing side of things? So we've already kind of alluded to this, right? Using rotation grazing and some of the advantages for that. So here again is kind of just there's 100 different ways to manage grazing there, so this is just a kind of very simple breakdown of some of the main. So continuous grazing, like I said, one pasture, right? They have access to the whole thing. simple rotation, so we maybe divided that into 4 quadrants. And maybe we're rotating it every couple days, once a week, every 2 weeks, some sort of, kind of more relaxed rotation. Or we can make it really intensive and we can make really small sections and we can rotate every day, or there are livestock producers that rotate several times a day. So, obviously that's not always practical, for an equine, operation, but just, know that there are people that are doing that. But the point here is that in this system over here on the left, where we have no rotation, that's where the animals are gonna go back to what they like. They're gonna continuously overgraze those areas. They're gonna utilize less of the total forage of the field. And so the good plants that we want to be there are gonna start to disappear because they're gonna be constantly consuming those. And what we're gonna be left with is the things that they don't like as much and overall decrease in production. We've actually done some calculations on utilization. So if you have a given pasture area, how much of that is actually utilized, what percent of the forage in that field is actually utilized. And with a continuous system, it's more like 30 to 40% on average. So you're actually only utilizing a third to up to maybe half of that total pasture, right? So that's not a lot of the whole thing. And if we flip from that to rotational grazing, regardless of if it's more of the simple kind of system or if it's more intense, we're controlling the amount of time they're spending in those different areas. We're letting the soil and the plants recover in the other areas. And we're getting better forage utilization, more even grazing, and like you said, more even manure distribution. If we compare the utilization number there, we've gone from say 30 to 40 up to 40 to 55 up to 55 to 70%. So increasing the amount of the forage that's out there that we're actually able to use, that we're actually grazing. And you can do the math, behind this a little bit and think of this in terms of yield of a pasture. So I just did a quick example. If we have a pasture that currently has 1 ton per acre of available forage, so every acre we have about 1 ton of grass out there. And we look at those percentages, we can have only 300 pounds an acre up to 700 pounds an acre. By going from a continuous system to a simple rotational grazing, it's like 1.8 times greater tons that we have to use just from switching from, us to a slight rotation. Or if we go from the continuous grazing up to the more intensive one, it can be up to 2.3 times more forage that's available. So over 2 times the amount of forage just by doing that rotation and that movement. So it can make a really big impact. People always ask when we talk about rotational grazing, so like, how do I know when to move them? How do I know when they're ready to move from pasture to pasture? It's not necessarily, I've been talking about one day rotation, 2-week rotation. It really shouldn't be by a set date. It shouldn't be by every week or every 2 weeks or whatever. It should be by actually when the forage is ready. And so you want to kind of try to find a time that balances the yield and quality. So we know as forages grow, they increase in yield, right? As they move from left to right. But they decrease in quality. So we kind of want to find that sweet spot that kind of balances those. They've done a lot of work. I don't expect you to read, don't worry, we're not going to read all this. They've done a lot of work looking at different forages, and they're like, what is the sweet spot for all these different forages? And if I pull out some of the ones that are kind of more common for our area, orchard grass, bluegrass, fescue, clover, you can see that the optimum for kind of starting grazing is always kind of around that like 8 to 10, 8 to 12-ish height is kind of what they thought of as the sweet spot. So there's a couple ways we can tell if a pasture is ready. We can take a measuring stick or a grazing stick or something like that around, measure a couple spots, or here's some grazing sticks. Or my favorite little go-to prop, if you have a water bottle, a coffee cup, whatever, you probably have a cup with you. If you put it tall side up, can I use your water bottle, please? If you put it this way and you set it in the grass, usually these are probably at least 8 inches tall, right? So that's kind of, okay, if it's taller than this, ready to start grazing. If you flip it this way, usually they're, 3 to 4 inches wide. If it's taller than, or if it's shorter than this, move them off. So on, off. That's kind of my easy way to. Yeah. Yes, we have grazing sticks if anyone was.
My person was saying, oh, sure.
Yeah. All right, so that's kind of a rough rule of thumb to keep in the back of your mind in terms of rotation. And we'll talk more about kind of when to move them off in a minute. So allow for adequate rest. This kind of goes along with rotation, right? We kind of talked about it a little bit, but I wanted to show you a little bit of the why behind when we say, you know, the plants need rest. Why is that? So in that continuous grazing system, most of the time, animals will go back and kind of graze off the same plant every 2, 3, up to kind of a week or so. And so that plant has using all of its energy reserves to put out some new shoots, and then they're going back and nipping it off, probably could, you know, several times in a row, right? And so that's really depleting the energy reserves of that plant. That plant is, you know, it's only able to put out a new shoot so many times and continuously get bit off so many times before it's not going to be able to continue to do that anymore. So that's where the proper rest following and grazing is key, and we can get a quicker plant recovery, and we can be ready to go back to that area more quickly if that plant has that little rest window. And so here's what that would look like kind of more visually. So this was just a couple of pots that were grown in a greenhouse just for like a visual demonstration purpose. And the pot on the left was put as if it was in kind of that continuous grazing system. So every week they went back and they cut it down to a 1-inch height. The one on the right was clipped as if it was more of a rotational system, right? So they gave it a rest period in between, and once a month they went in and they clipped it, not down quite as tight, but to 3.5 inches. So does that make sense? So continuous on the left, rotational on the right. They did that, you know, several times over the course of you know, a few months or so. And then this picture was taken at cutting, so they just cut it again after, you know, repeating this several times. This was 6 days later. So this is the difference in production when we have a rotational system where that plant has had that time to rest, replenish its energy reserves, it's able to grow back much more quickly compared to the one on the left, which is really kind of starting to get depleted. It's having a harder time continuing to grow back.
So in a high growth season, month, you're saying fields shouldn't be cut, because we maintain by mowing. So they shouldn't be cut lower than 10 inches or 8
Oh,
inches.
so you're talking about when you can't keep up with the pasture because it's growing so fast,
Or
you
to
have
maintain-
excess.
Or to maintain ponies, and that also comes to where sugar is coming into
Yes,
play.
yeah,
So I'm trying to make sense of this.
Yeah.
And figure out how to maintain ponies.
yeah. So, okay, the ponies aside, because that's a whole other issue. If we're looking to maintain production, so there are times of the year when our forages are growing so fast that like we're not going to be able to keep up with them, right? And so that's when the like plants on the left start to get taller, they start to get more mature, they kind of get a little overgrown. And so then sometimes it does pay to like go in and run with the mower. It's not the 8 inches that you have to follow, it's the 3 to 4 inches. So we don't want to be, we'll talk about, actually, we'll talk about residual height in a minute. So yeah, hold that thought. But yeah, so this is just illustrating the benefit of that rest on the plants. And then remember that whatever we see above the soil surface is pretty much reflective of what's happening below the soil surface as well. So anytime those plants are doing really well and they're very vigorous above ground, there's a good chance that the roots are very vigorous and are doing well below ground as well. So the repeated grazing, the continuous grazing, the plant's having a harder time, above ground, those roots are also going to be shortened underneath, which again means less nutrient uptake, less water uptake, less resilient plants over time. You get where I'm going with that. So here's a kind of illustrating that. So the plants on the left, these were all cut to the same height, to 2 inches. Every week on the left, every 2 weeks in the middle, and every 4 weeks on the right. And you can see above ground, obviously, the difference in the forage growth, but you can also see below ground difference in the root growth. And you can see how it's kind of reflective of each other. So a healthier plant that's more vigorous and is growing back better is also going to have a healthier root system, which makes sense, right? That's something that plant. So what do we do if, say, the opposite of the case she was just talking about, say we're ready to rotate and the pastures haven't grown back to above our water bottle height? What do we do then? Well, in that case, Sometimes, we may have to rely on like a dry lot or a sacrifice, could be if you don't have a dry lot, one area of the paddock that you designate as your sacrifice area, knowing you're probably gonna overgraze it, you're probably gonna kind of hurt that area a little bit or send it back a little bit, but, that you'll save the rest of the pasture area, right? Oops. Here's just, a picture of an example of a dry lot. These can be useful at times of the year when it's too wet. So when we have all the mud and we need to be feeding hay. Or times of the year when it, in the heat of the summer, when our cool season forages have really slowed down, sometimes we may need to add a little bit of hay. Forage production, then the key is to kind of use a designated area so that the rest of the pasture has time to rest and regrow and follow that cycle. All right, so keeping pastures vegetative. So this sort of ties into kind of what we alluded to a little bit. So maturity is the biggest thing that affects nutritive value, right? So there's that inverse relationship. As forages go up in yield, they go down in quality. It's true of all forages, no matter what we're growing. So we see that happening here. As these forages go from kind of a nice leafy vegetative stage up to a more mature stage, they have more stems, they have more fiber, they have less protein, they have less of the leaves, they have less kind of minerals and vitamins. So here's a leafy example on the left, or a more mature example. That's where you start to see some of those seed heads in production. And we know that animals are preferential, right? We already said that they're very variable. Horses are notorious for being one of the worst at this. I encourage you, if you're seeing a huge amount of variability, to think about not only, okay, can I get on the mower and eliminate some of that, because that is a strategy, but also, can I use rotational grazing as a strategy to eliminate that a little bit? If you notice that they're continuously having this half of the field grazed down really low, and this half of the field, which is maybe the back half or further away, can you fence them in back there, even if it's just for a little while or something, and kind of, use your rotation to force them to kind of even out the uneven distribution. And then of course, mowing or clipping is also a strategy, that we can use. But here's where my expense comes in. Fuel costs money, right? And time to be on the mower. So I encourage you to think about ways to use rotation to kind of help at least a little bit with that, rather than immediately always just mowing it to make it nice. All right, and then residual. So this is the other big one. So residual is, we talked about kind of when to start grazing, right? So the water bottle upright, we want to be taller than that ideally. What about when to stop grazing? So for anyone who's not familiar with the term residual, basically that means how much is left after we're done with it. So residual could be like after you take a hay cutting or after you mow, what's the height of what's left? Or it could be after grazing, what's the height of what's left in that field? And if we think back to like our high school biology class, what does a plant need to grow? Sunlight is the main one, right? The driver of photosynthesis. So if we think about photosynthesis and sunlight as the driver, basically those plants are like little solar panels, right? They're collecting that sunlight, harvesting that energy from the sun, and then they're using that to make their own energy for growth. So there's actually two ways a plant produces energy for growth. Anyone want to give a shot with one or even both of them are? Sort of just talked about one. What are the two sources of energy that a plant has? Sun and water. Okay, those contribute to photosynthesis. So leaf area remaining. If a plant is completely grazed off or completely scalped, there's no green leaf material left. Are they going to be able to photosynthesize? Probably not, right? So they need that green growing leaf area to be able to photosynthesize. So if I have these two plants, which these were taken from the research station after being grazed by the sheep, I just found one that was grazed a little more tightly, one that was grazed a little less tightly. They were in the same pasture. There's always variability, right? But the one on the top is a lot less leaf material, right? So it's going to have a very slow rate of photosynthesis as it tries to regrow. The one on the bottom, was grazed off. I don't know if it's maybe a little hard for you to tell, but it was very tall before that. So it was grazed off quite a bit, but there's still a lot of leaf material there. So it's gonna have a relatively rapid rate of photosynthesis, has more leaf material to churning up that energy. So what's the other source of energy? I'll give you a hint. When we are gonna run a marathon, we carbo load the night before to store in our energy reserves, right? So plants have energy reserves as well. It's not glycogen in the muscle. But they store carbohydrates as an energy reserve. So most of our grasses store a lot of their energy reserves in the stem base. So this little area right down here, like the bottom 3 to 4 inches, is where a lot of grasses store a lot of their energy reserves. Some legumes or a lot of legumes store it in the root system, so they're a little bit more protected. But grasses are especially more vulnerable for this. So if we think about that and we think about residual height, so you know how tightly we're grazing. If we're grazing lower, so lower residual, we're cutting it off shorter. We have less leaf area for photosynthesis. We have less of those stored carbohydrates remaining because we've removed some of them, right? So overall, that plant has less energy or less, robustness. If on the other side, we have a higher grazing height, if we leave just, I'm talking not, 8-10 inches, I'm talking like 2 to 3 inches different. If you leave a little bit more, that plant has more leaf area remaining to photosynthesize. And it also has more stored carbohydrates remaining. So it has, double the opportunity for regrowth. And that's where, again, you can tie it back to those 2 images. So the one on the right is going to be able to regrow a lot quicker, a lot more like that pot that was on the right earlier compared to the one on the left. And you can actually put some numbers behind this. So this is just a growth curve that's showing a growth rate in terms of pounds per acre per day. I think this one is tall fescue, so just kind of a cool season grass. And so this is basically, these are cutting height down here, or residual height. So 0, 2, 4, 6, or 8 inches of residual remaining after grazing or after a harvest. And then this is how quickly that plant is able to grow in terms of pounds per energy per day, according to those different heights. So if we look at the 2-inch height, so we cut it off at 2 inches, and we track over to our curve, we're somewhere around probably 35 pounds per acre per day. The number doesn't matter, but 35 pounds per acre per day. If we compare that to the 4-inch height, we're more like 50 pounds per acre per day. So that plant is growing back faster. Does that make sense? And if we think about that, so a lot of people are like, okay, I want to maximize my forage utilization in my pasture. I want to use it all. I want them to graze it evenly down to 2 inches, right? I'm arguing that if you leave just a couple extra inches in the field, you'll see some benefit, not necessarily in that grazing cycle, but over the whole lifespan, whole season, whole lifespan of that plant. So if they actually calculate the time it took each of those plants to regrow back to 1 ton of forage, it was 64 days for the 2-inch one versus only 40 days for the other one. So you see how like it grows back quicker, it's able to continue to produce more over that whole kind of lifespan. And so that's why sometimes they say, take half, leave half, or it takes grass to grow grass. All those things are kind of based on this principle. And again, I would argue that overgrazing costs money, not necessarily the time it's done, but over the long run, right? Over the lifespan. All right, and then the only other thing with residual is what else have we not thought about in terms, we've talked about production, we've talked about, how tightly you're cutting or grazing that and how that can deplete energy reserves. What other difference do you see in these 2 photos? The soil that's visible, right? So it protects the surface from rain by leaving that little bit of extra leaf material out there. So we're mitigating soil erosion. So the first, thing to soil erosion is actually a raindrop hitting the soil surface, right? Making a tiny, tiny little crater. That's kind of the start to soil erosion in a minuscule scale. And it's also keeping the soil cool. So remember, we talked about all the biology that's happening below the soil surface. All that biological activity doesn't like to get overheated, right? It likes to be in that nice, cool, kind of moist environment. Also, a lot of our forages are predominantly cool season forages, right? So they grow better in cooler, kind of wetter conditions. They don't like, especially here when it gets really hot and dry in summertime, they don't do as well. They don't grow as well. And so just this like small difference can really make a huge difference in the temperature at the soil surface. And they've actually studied that. So the blue columns you see here were cut to 4.5 inches, and also the green ones too. And the red ones were cut down to 1 inch. So the only difference there is the height that they were cut to, and 4.5 to 1 is whatever, 3.5 inches different, right? And these are showing temperatures. The top one is average soil temperature. The bottom one is maximum daily temperature at the crown of the plant. And you can see that in both cases, at that 1 inch cutting height, when it was cut down lower, we saw a much higher temperature at the soil surface and at the crown of the plant. So affecting that soil biology and also affecting the conditions that are favorable for those plants. Make sense? All right, and then if we tie all of that together, so production and soil temperature and all those different things, and we look at, remember we said that seed is expensive, right? Seed costs, we want our forages to persist for a long time. So this is looking at persistence, this is cutting height, but same thing could be said for grazing height. You can ignore the different green columns, but this is cut down to 1/2 inch, cut down to 2 inches, and cut down to 4 inches. And showing the percent persistence out of 100% over time. So over, a year or more. And at the 2 inch height, we were down to maybe what, 50% left. At the 4 inch height, we were either very close to or at 100% still there. So it does make a difference in the long run for the longevity of that plant. Seed cost money. There it is. All right, so there's, number 6, I'm getting ahead of myself. So the last one, we're not really gonna focus a lot on weed control, we can talk all night about that. But I just wanted to mention a couple of things because we know that weeds do compete with our forages, right? For those nutrients and water and all the resources. They can also sometimes reduce intake, especially if they're prickly or thistly, and then we're decreasing the utilization of our pasture there, right? And then there's potential for toxicity with certain weeds, so of course we want to avoid those. So if I were to ask you, what is the #1 way to eliminate the majority of weed problems? What would your answer be?
I don't think growing grass.
Good thick growing grass. Cutting a weed is a strategy. Good thick growing grass will outcompete the weeds every day. So weeds are very opportunistic, right? They see a space, they see a hole, they see an opening, and that's when they start to come up and flourish. So the more we have a good solid thick stand of forages, that charts I showed with the temperature, they also looked at stand persistence there. And the ones that were cut down to 1 inch, it was a fescue field and it started to become crabgrass over time because the fescue just couldn't withstand that continuous defoliation. The ones that were cut to 4.5 inches, they were able to maintain. So it does work. Maintaining a healthy stand of forages is the best way to outcompete weeds. We do have obviously a lot of other strategies to combat weeds. There's more than just, herbicides or chemical control. So cultural control would be things like selecting forage species when we're planting that works well with our environment. Different forages grow better on different soil types and different conditions. Maintaining that fertility, so we're setting those plants up for success. Mechanical control, there's where your clipping or mowing comes in. Especially for any annual weeds, we can stop them from producing seed and spreading seed in that way. Biological control, if any of you happen to have any goats or sheep, they're a very good means of biological control. They'll eat a lot of the weeds that horses won't necessarily eat. And then chemical control, of course, we do have some herbicide options that are a tool in our toolbox. Just know when we're looking at herbicides that if you're trying to decide on an herbicide, it depends on what weed you have. And also the growth cycle of that weed. Is it an annual? Is it a perennial? Is it a winter annual? Is it a summer annual? So you need to not only consider, you need to know what weed you have so you can decide based on the type of weed and also the timing that you need to hit that weed at for the best success. All right, so there we go. I know I've kind of covered a lot, a whole host of different things, kind of all pertaining to grazing management. There's just a list of things we went over, and my advice would be to start simply. If you're thinking about trying some rotation, if you want to do a better job with your pastures, take a big field and cut it in half, right? And flip-flop sides. You're already doubling the amount of rest that that field is getting, right? Before it was 0, now it's 50% of the time. Start simple. You don't have to do all these elaborate, crazy rotations. But you know, every little bit will help in the long run. I think that was the last one. I just put my contact information up there if anyone has any questions. I didn't print anything, but I'm happy to share this presentation. If anyone wants a copy, just shoot me an email, or Erica, either one of us.
And I can send out to their email.
Sure, that works too. Yep. So we can make sure you guys get that. And then I also wanted to mention that either online on the Facebook page or on the website, I've started kind of an events page for upcoming events that are pertaining to forages kind of in the region. So we'll be doing a lot of pasture walks. We have a grazing school coming up again this year, and other things like that. So there's also an email list on the website. So I've been sending out kind of a once a month update, you know, some timely information. If you're interested in any of that, it's all on there.
And April 19th, but it doesn't have us yet, but we're having a pasture walk here.
There you go. 19, picking it up.
I'm sure they'll be here. Any
All right.
questions?
Cool.
Okay, thank you.
Yep, no problem.
Alright, so I'm gonna tie all of that in and talk about nutrient management planning, before we go. And also some cost share options that might be available to you guys as well from soil conservation and RCS. How many of you have a nutrient management plan? Good. Do you have one? Oh, yeah. Well, how many of you have 8 or more animals? They still count. And you probably make more than $2,500 a year.
Gross, right?
Yeah. Okay. So that means you need a plan. Hold on one second. Share the screen. Okay, so it's a good thing that you guys don't have a plan, so you know I can actually teach you something tonight. So we're gonna talk about nutrient management planning. If this works. I don't know, maybe. Okay. So nutrient management is a law through the state of Maryland. It started in 1998. It's kind of part of the Chesapeake Watershed Act. It's kind of all stems from EPA down to Maryland Department of Agriculture. So they put out the Maryland General Assembly passed this law requiring you to have this plan if you have 8 or more animal units and or if you're making $2,500 a year on your operation. Which we all know $2,500 is like 2 horses being boarded at your house right now. So you probably fall into this category. Basically, the purpose of these plans are to minimize nutrient losses, to make sure you're not over fertilizing, but at the same time, making sure that you know like what your soil health looks like, so you can manage your pastures appropriately. So they go by the 4 R's. The right product, right time, right place, and right rate. These plans can be done by, so University of Maryland has a plan writer in every county. Well, we're supposed to, right now we don't, because we are hiring. So if you need a job, we have 7 openings. I'm on the hiring committee, so I would love more people. But every county is supposed to have a plan writer that can write a plan for you free of cost. That might change here in the next year or 2, but it won't be a lot of money that they'll be requiring. If not, you can go to a private consultant. There's private consultants in this area. Baltimore County Soil Conservation actually just passed a thing with their board. They are doing a cost share reimbursement up to $200 on your plan if you have to go to a private consultant. So that's a good deal to take care of your plan this year to help with university not having enough plan writers. So you'll need a lot of different things for this plan. It'll come into like a binder. It's a big giant binder that you can hand into MDA, and it's very easily to be going through reading, but you'll need a lot of things for your plan writer to write your plan. First is soil samples. So Amanda talked about soil sampling your pastures. Well, this is a good time that you're gonna have to do it anyway, okay? I have a soil probe that I can lend out to you guys. And we can give you a list of soil testing labs So you definitely need a soil test for all of your pastures that you have. And they consider them into management units. So if you have two fields that are kind of adjoined, they just have like a fence line through them, they're in the same area, they kind of have the same soil type. You're managing them the same, that's just one field, right? So you don't have to do every single itty bitty paddock that you have. These tests cost around $14 a test. It's not terribly expensive, but if you have a million different paddocks, it's gonna add up, right? So they just in the general area will work. So I typically, with horse farms, we'll get, say, 4 soil samples done, and kind of conjoin them together. So when we're soil sampling, you're gonna wanna do a bunch of different areas in your pasture. So one pasture, for your one soil sample, you're gonna take, say, 10 to 15 different cores. You're gonna walk around in the zigzag in your field, take these cores, put them in a bucket, mix it all together, and then put it into like a pint-sized bag, and that's soil sample 1. And then you'll just repeatedly do that throughout your field. You're gonna wanna go, I say 6 inches, 6 to 8 inches in the ground. If you're just doing pH, 2 inches into it is what you want. But to look at the soil fertility for nutrient management planning, you're gonna want 6 to 8 inches, okay? And it's easy, these soil cores are easier than using a shovel, because the shovel, you're like digging up the whole earth with it. So the soil cores are easier. Once you have them, and I have in your packet as well of like a how-to, and then online, we offer all the different soil labs that are around in this area. We used to have one here in Maryland, we don't anymore, but there's right up in Pennsylvania and Delaware. You can also get these done, send them to the mill and say, hey, please take care of this, and they'll send it off for you. It might cost you a couple extra dollars, but they can take care of it, and then they'll get the reports back to you. You'll also need manure samples if you're spreading manure on your farm. If you're not spreading it, you don't, you just need to know who is taking your manure from you. And you need to keep records of who's taking it, when they're taking it, and how much they're taking. But if you are spreading manure, you're gonna need a soil sample. You have more than 20 animals. So if you're under 20 horses and you are still spreading manure, you no longer need that. That's a new thing that came up in the last couple of years. But manure samples are calculated into fertility for your soil. Another thing is property tax ID numbers. It's really easy to locate this. If you go Google Maryland's real property search, you can look up everyone's history of their property, how long it's been there, how much they paid for it, and their property ID. So you can just type in your address in this website, and it'll give you your tax ID number. It'll tell you if you're ag assessed, if you're not ag assessed. And you'll need those to give to your plan writer. Property maps are good, at least like a Google map. We then have to make this fancy map that you can see it has the it has the streams in it, and then we have like all of our different paddocks. But if you at least have a Google map that we can draw your paddocks on there, so then when we're making the nice map, we have an idea. Is there someone there? Okay. Isn't it? This place can't be haunted. It's like only 10 years old. There you go. Oh, whoa, stop. Okay. I don't know what's happening here. Next thing you'll need to know is crops. For you, obviously, it's just gonna be pastures, but if say you have a vegetable farm as well, you're gonna need to say that you're growing sweet corn, or if you rent your land out to some of your farmers, you might want to add that into your plan as well. Typically, if you are the one managing the farm, you are the one that needs to be in charge of the plan. So if you're renting out your land to someone else and you're managing this part, someone else is managing over here, their part should be in their plan, but double check, that's not always the case. So you might have to add in the crops that they're growing as well. Animals, you're gonna need to tell them how many animals you roughly have throughout the year. Obviously, that always varies, you know, especially in boarding operations. So just like a rough estimate of how many animals you have throughout the year. Bedding, how much bedding you're using, you can, rough estimate again. But you need to know how much bedding you're using and what type of bedding. Turnout schedule. Manure storage, if you're going to apply the manure, you need to know how much you're applying. And then again, I said like the transportation, you need name, address, and phone number of where the manure is going now. It sounds like a lot, but once you have this plan in place, every year it's just an easy update of, they just update your animal numbers and your soil fertility tests. So once you have all of this information and you have a plan, if you are applying fertilizer of any sort, commercial or organic, you need to take in consideration of setbacks with waterways if you have waters through your like streams or anything through your field. So you cannot broadcast anything 35 feet from the water edge, okay? Same with if you have pastures, you're supposed to be a 10-foot setback. Your animals are not technically legally allowed to be in your waterways anymore. That's why we have cost share for that. They'll come in and they can put in fencing and they'll put in waterways through there to minimize erosion. We don't, typically horses are not wading in the streams, but cows do. So it's kind of how that evolved from here. This really doesn't really apply as much to horses as it does to the dairy farmers around here, but we have spring and summer is when we can apply any nutrients. Fall, we can apply everything but poultry litter. Now we have to remember from December 15th to March 1st, we cannot apply manure anywhere, like absolutely anywhere. And if you have, and I know because I gallop for some of these people, they have like little trails of manure in their woods or little trails like that we gallop on. That's super illegal. And if somebody from MDA comes out, they'll make you stop doing that. They just don't because the ground is frozen. So it's just running off into some waterway and going eventually into the bay, which is leading to all these algae blooms. It's not just us that's causing these issues. Obviously, there's bigger issues there, but we're not allowed to do that. So only from March 1st to December 15th can we spread manure and fertilizer. And there's no emergency provisions unless you're a dairy farmer and you have liquid manure running over somewhere. If it's stackable, it has to stay in one place until March 1st. Obviously, you wouldn't be stacking it in the middle of, next to waterways, but it has to be, your manure pile has to be 100 feet away from any surface water, 150 feet from your wells or springs, and 200 feet from from your property lines. The 200 feet is important. I've had several angry neighbors call people in, and then I have to go out and assess this because they has to be 200 feet away from property lines. So just in case you have a neighbor that gets kind of in a tizzy about things. Record keeping, this is really important. You probably already do this for, taxes anyway. So just keep all your records, your receipts, and put it in this binder because then when MDA comes out to check on it, they'll know how much fertilizer you applied, how much manure, what your animals look like. So it's just easier. You can just throw the book at them and say, here, it's all in there. You guys can look at it. You have to keep them for 3 years. After that, you can do whatever you want with them, throw away. Oh, geez. If you are spreading manure or fertilizer yourself, you're supposed to have a nutrient voucher, which is super easy to attain. I do classes on that twice a year. It's a 2-hour class. You come in and it's just basic nutrient management to make sure you're not going around any rules, regulations. It's free, but it's just a little voucher that you have to have. Once you have the plan, you'll turn it into MDA just one time and they'll have you on record. So then they can keep track. Each year they'll tell you to give them some more information about yourself, just called the annual implementation report. It just basically tells them how much fertilizer you applied and your animal numbers. Again, it's more government tracking that goes to EPA, but we all have to do it. If you have any questions about the program, these are Dwight Goddard and David Rupert are in charge of the program. So if you want to get any of this cost share programming through soil conservation, you'll need to have one of these nutrient management plans as well. But I want to make sure a lot of the big time farmers take advantage of these cost share programs, but most people don't because we don't know that they even exist. So if you have over 15 horses, you can get full cost share available. And these cost share things happen on pasture. Do you need waters, automatic waters put in, gutters? Any heavy use areas, like Amanda was saying, hey, during the winter, you put your horses into a heavy use area. They'll put those in, manure storage pits. So when they say on here, like up to 87%, some of them are 100% cost share. So there's money out there that we don't utilize, all the big guys get, and they put them each year, the governor gives us an allotted amount, they put it in a pot, and then they kind of see who gets it. So the more horse people involved, the more money we can get, so over 15 horses, you get the full cost share, between 8 and 15, you get a prorated rate. And then anything below 8, they don't have any money for that right now, they're working on a small equine program. It just has to go through the General Assembly to get it into works. But I want you guys to know that there is money out there for us to use, and make use of it. Sure, and the numbers on the back for Palmer County or whatever county you're in. You can call their office and they'll have someone come out and assess the situation that you have going on. Yeah, any questions about that? Gave you a lot of